They worked from before sunrise until after dark. And during the worst seasons, especially on sugar plantations, some enslaved people were forced to work so long that the day almost disappeared. 18 hours, sometimes close to 20. Cutting cane, carrying loads, feeding mills, boiling sugar, working through heat, smoke, exhaustion, and fear. And after all of that, this was what many were given: cornmeal, salted pork, molasses, maybe a few sweet potatoes, maybe peas, maybe scraps. Enough to keep a body moving, not enough to make a person well. That was the point. Food on slave plantations was not just food. It was control. It was calculation. It was part of the system. Because enslavers were not asking, what does this person need to live a healthy life? They were asking something colder. What is the cheapest amount of food that can keep this person working? That question shaped the daily meal of millions of enslaved people in America. And the answer was often brutal. The first thing to understand is that enslaved people did not usually receive meals in the way we imagine meals today. They were often given rations, a measured amount of basic food, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, sometimes irregularly. The ration might include cornmeal, a small amount of salted meat, and sometimes molasses or other cheap supplies. Cornmeal was one of the most common staples. It could be cooked into mush, baked into ash cakes, made into cornbread, boiled into something thick enough to fill the stomach for a while. Salted pork was also common, but it was not always fresh, generous, or clean. It was preserved meat, heavy with salt, cheap enough to distribute, strong enough to last. Molasses might be given as a sweetener or calorie source. Sweet potatoes, peas, beans, or greens might appear depending on the region, season, and plantation. But the key word is ration. A ration was not designed around dignity. It was designed around labor. The enslaver controlled how much food was given, when it was given, who received it, and whether punishment, shortage, or neglect would make hunger worse. This meant that hunger was not an accident. Hunger was built into plantation life. For many enslaved people, the official ration was not enough, so survival depended on what they could grow, gather, hunt, fish, cook, trade, hide, or stretch. After long hours of forced labor, many had to work again just to feed themselves and their families. They planted small gardens near their cabins. They grew sweet potatoes, greens, peas, beans, corn, herbs, or whatever the soil and time allowed. They fished in nearby streams. They trapped small animals. They gathered wild plants. They raised chickens when allowed. They saved scraps. They stretched meals. They shared food across families. They turned almost nothing into something. And this is one of the most important parts of the story. Enslaved people were not passive recipients of plantation rations. They were constantly working to survive beyond what the enslaver provided. The official ration tells us what slaveholders wanted to spend, but the food culture enslaved people created tells us how they resisted starvation, preserved knowledge, cared for children, and built community under impossible conditions. A small garden was not just a garden. It was survival. A pot of greens was not just a meal. It was memory. A shared dish was not just food. It was family holding itself together in a world designed to break it apart. But none of this should make the system sound less cruel. Because the fact that enslaved people had to produce extra food after forced labor shows how inadequate the ration often was. Imagine working all day in a field. Your body is exhausted. Your hands ache. Your back hurts. The sun is gone. And now, instead of resting, you still have to cook. You still have to tend a garden. You still have to feed children. You still have to make tomorrow possible. That was daily life for many enslaved families. The workday did not end when field labor ended. Survival itself became a second shift. And for women, the burden could be especially heavy. Enslaved women were often forced to labor in the fields and then expected to cook, care for children, wash, repair clothing, and hold families together after the day's forced labor was finished. A mother might work for the plantation all day, then return to a cabin and try to make a meal from cornmeal, scraps, greens, or whatever she had managed to save. She might feed children first. She might go hungry herself. She might stretch a small ration across more people than it was meant to feed. Every meal required calculation. How much can we eat tonight? How much must be saved? Who needs it most? Can this last until ration day? That is what the daily meal meant. It was never just a plate. It was a struggle against hunger. And plantation owners understood this. Food could be used to reward. Food could be used to punish. Food could be withheld. Food could be reduced. Food could be distributed in ways that reminded enslaved people that even eating was controlled by someone else. This is why the plantation ration was part of the power structure. The enslaver controlled the land, controlled the labor, controlled movement, controlled family stability, and controlled the basic food supply. That meant hunger could become a weapon without anyone calling it a weapon. A smaller ration, a delayed ration, bad meat, too little cornmeal, no time to cook properly, no time to grow enough. The result was the same. A body pushed to work while never fully nourished. The details changed from plantation to plantation. Some enslaved people received slightly more. Some received less. Some had access to gardens, fishing, or hunting. Others had almost no time or resources. Urban enslaved workers might eat differently from field workers. House servants might have access to leftover food, though. That did not mean they were free from control or abuse. Children, elderly people, pregnant women, and the sick were especially vulnerable when food was inadequate. But across the system, one pattern appears again and again. Food was tied to labor value. Those who were forced to work were fed in ways meant to keep them useful, not comfortable, not healthy. Useful. That is why the daily meal of enslaved people reveals something deeper than diet. It reveals the logic of slavery itself. A human being was treated like a cost. Food was an expense. Labor was the return. And the enslaver tried to keep the expense as low as possible. This was not only cruel, it was economic. That is why simple foods like cornmeal and salted pork carry such heavy historical meaning. They were not just ingredients. They were part of a system that calculated human survival in the cheapest possible terms. But enslaved people transformed those limited ingredients into forms of endurance. Cornmeal became cakes, mush bread, and thick meals that could keep a person moving. Greens became nourishment when meat was scarce. Sweet potatoes became survival food. Beans and peas added strength when available. Molasses added calories and flavor. Fish, game, and garden vegetables helped fill the gaps that rations left behind. Food traditions formed under pressure. Cooking methods were adapted. African, Native American, and European foodways blended under violent conditions. Knowledge passed from elders to children. People learned what could be planted quickly, what could be preserved, what could be stretched, what could be shared. In that sense, food was also culture, and culture became resistance. A shared meal could remind people they were more than labor. A garden could give a small measure of control in a life where control was constantly stolen. A recipe could preserve memory. A cooking fire could become a place where stories, warnings, grief, and hope passed quietly from one person to another. But we should never romanticize this. The creativity of enslaved people existed because the conditions forced it. Their resilience does not excuse the starvation economy that made resilience necessary. The beauty of survival does not erase the brutality of being denied enough. So when we ask, what did enslaved people eat every day? The answer is not only cornmeal, salted pork, molasses, and vegetables. The real answer is harder. They ate what a system of forced labor allowed them to have. They ate what they could make from rationed scarcity. They ate after working for someone else's profit. They ate under surveillance. They ate with the knowledge that tomorrow would demand their bodies again. And they ate while trying to keep families alive inside a system that measured them in labor price and output. This is why the daily meal matters, because it shows slavery at its most ordinary. Not the auction block, not the chase, not the dramatic scene history books prefer, but the bowl, the ration, the small piece of meat, the cornmeal, the garden after dark, the mother stretching food for her children, the worker eating just enough to stand up again before sunrise. That is where the system becomes visible. In the everyday, in the repeated, in the way hunger was made normal, and in the way enslaved people still found ways to survive, cook, share, remember, and care for one another. So the next time someone imagines slavery only as fields, chains, and auctions, remember the meal. Remember the ration. Remember the question behind it. Not, what does this person need? But how little can we give them and still force them to work? That was the cruelty hidden inside the daily meal. And that is the part history books often skip.